Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 2. I want to get back to this video over here. I want to kind of try to skip back and forth so I can try to go over everything that I wanted to talk about. So I want to talk a little bit about this Christ oil as well as some other things as well. But the reason I stopped the video over here at this point is probably not the best place to stop the video, but I just wanted to show how the cerebral spinal fluid, where it actually is located, it's between the cranium. It basically is the fluid that protects your brain and your spinal cord, and so it runs up and down between the brain and down the spinal cord. But the point that I wanted to make is that there's two organs that actually spread throughout your entire body, and that would be your heart and your brain, because with your heart you have your blood vessels that flow throughout your entire body, and with your brain you have the nerves that stem from your brain and your spinal cord that spread throughout your entire body. And so those are your two vital organs that actually compose your entire body. And so I think this is a good representation of the soul and the spirit, because there's a lot of confusion in terms of what actually comes from your brain and what actually comes from your heart. Even in this video over here, it quoted Proverbs 4:23, where it says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. So over here, God is saying that everything flows from your heart, but we also have our brain, and all our functions also come from our brain. So it's hard to distinguish what actually comes from your heart and what comes from your brain. Those are the two sources of life. Those are your two most important vital organs that, like I said, comprise your entire body. And so it's a good representation of the soul and the spirit. So they're almost inseparable. But over here, the Bible tells us that the Word of God is quick and powerful, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, and the joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and the intents of the heart. So only the Word of God can divide between the soul and the spirit and the thoughts and the intents of the heart. So only God can distinguish between the two. And so the point that I want to make is that this is all ultimately about DNA, and it's interesting that this comes up in verse 23. In fact, there's a lot of verse 23s or 22s that come up in this video. But as I've explained before, the sword, or the two-edged sword that it speaks of here, the Word of God, is DNA, as I've mentioned before. And I've explained how it was when I was looking at Genesis 3:23 and 24, which again, I believe these numbers represent DNA. And this is when Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden. And it says over here, so he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. And it was when I was looking at this in Greek that I saw that the sword itself is what was twisted, because I always imagined that the cherubim would be brandishing some kind of sword and waving it back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. But it's the sword itself that is twisted or intertwined, and it's the sword itself that represents the DNA, or the Word of God, as well as the tree of life, which represents God and represents Jesus. And so the DNA is what guards the way to the tree of life. Okay, so the point that I wanted to make is that this is all about DNA, and I believe that the Christ or the cerebral spinal fluid is a good illustration of what's being talked about here in Matthew 25, where it says that the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. And as I mentioned in my last video, the word vessels is this word over here in the Greek, the word angion, which can refer to vessels such as this, but it can also refer to your blood vessels. And I believe this is all ultimately about DNA and receiving. I talked about how the word took actually means to receive. So the wise received oil, or they received Jesus's DNA in their vessels, which is their entire being. And so this can be represented by the blood vessels that flow throughout your entire body, or it can be represented by the central nervous system that flows throughout your entire body, or both. But it's all about receiving Christ's DNA. And so the other point that I wanted to make is that what's explained in this video is a good representation of what will take place when Jesus comes back, when he consummates the covenant. It pretty much tells the story of the Bible, just like the stars tell the story of the Bible. It's also depicted within our own bodies. I know Enter the Stars has done some videos about how the human body tells the story of the Bible. But what I would caution against concerning this video or these teachings is that a lot of these teachings are New Age teachings, and these are works-based teachings, and they teach that the oil is not really Jesus, it's just the cerebral spinal fluid, and that Jesus is not really going to come back. It's just achieving a certain heightened, elevated experience by living right. And so this is obviously New Age, and this is not biblical, but I do believe that the functions inside the human body tell the story, just like the stars tell the story of God. And so what's interesting is when you get to the end over here. Okay, actually, before I get to the end, I'll go back to the beginning of where this all starts. Okay, this is not exactly where it starts. Apparently the cerebral spinal fluid starts from the brain, and then it flows down the spine, but then it makes its way back up to the brain. And so what it's talking about over here is that it reaches this point over here where the spinal fluid goes all the way down to the sacrum, and the name for this part of the body actually came from, say, a mid-18th century word which means sacred bone. So this is referred to as the sacred bone. Okay, now I just want to point out some things in the Greek. In my last video, I had mentioned how the word over here for the 7 lamps is a word that's used just one time in the New Testament. This particular form of the word for lamps is used one time, and that's in Luke 12:35, where Jesus said, "Let your loins be girded about, and your lights burning, and ye yourselves like unto men that wait for their Lord when he will return from the wedding, that when he cometh and knocketh, they may open unto him immediately. Blessed are their servants whom the Lord, when he cometh, shall find watching. Verily I say unto you, that he shall gird himself and make them to sit down to meat, and will come forth and serve them." Okay, if you look at the word for loins, and I've explained the meaning of the word loins, and it basically refers to the region from the waist down to the what would be the sacrum that I showed in the other video, and I can show you this image. You can see it a little bit better. But over here, it's talking about the spinal column, and this is the part over here that has the word ospis, which means loins. This is the ospiki cambili. This is the curve that's that part of the body, and over here it's talking about the spinal column. And then over here, just under that, this part is called Ieru, and I'll show you what that word means. Okay, I'll just type it in English, and you can see what it means. It means sacred or sanctuary or holy. So it's this word right here. This is actually the word that's used to describe the temple in the Bible, and I'll show you that, or the holy place. Okay, here's that word in the Strong's. It's 2413. It's the word ieros, and it means sacred, consecrated to the deity pertaining to God. And if you see how it's used, you see that it's talking about holy things, the holy scriptures. It refers to the high priest in this form. You can see that it means a priest, and it can refer to the high priest. Okay, I wanted to show you how it can refer to the temple, and so I just saw that over here, and so when I copy and pasted that, you can see that that form refers to the temple. And so see that it means the temple, either the whole building or specifically the outer courts open to worshipers. So it's talking about the temple complex. Okay, so when you look at the spinal column, you see this word right here is the same word that's used to describe the holy place or the temple or the holy things such as the scriptures or the high priest. So this is the most holy place right here. Okay, so that seems to conform with this video over here. Another thing that I wanted to mention about the word for the sacrum in the Greek. Okay, over here in Zechariah 4, it talks about a bowl that's on top of the 7 candlesticks that feeds oil to the 7 lamps, which have 7 pipes leading to the 7 lamps that are above the menorah or the candlestick, which of course represents the bride. Well, if you look at the word bowl in the Greek, okay, I'll just put it in the English, and you can see that it's also the same word for the word pelvis in the Greek. So you can see that means either a bowl or the pelvis. Okay, so now I'm going to get back to about the end of this video where the oil or the spinal fluid works its way back up to the brain, to a part of the brain called the thalamus, which is actually a Greek word, as it explains in this video. And they're saying here that it has 2 hemispheres just like the earth, and it also looks like the Ark of the Covenant. But if you look at the word thalamus in the Greek, okay, I actually bookmarked the definition here, but this is the word thalamus in the Greek, and it means an inner room or chamber, generally the woman's apartment, the inner part of the house, the chamber or the bedroom, or the bride chamber. Okay, and as you can see, Jesus was in the bride chamber for the first 3.5 years at his first coming. And of course, when he comes back, he'll fulfill the second half of that. But this is where it's saying that once the Christ oil reaches the thalamus, that's when you achieve all of these things over here. And so I'm about out of time, so I'll have to continue with more in the next video.